Verity Rourke was 41 years old when she stood in the mud outside her own front door with $9.40 sewn into her hem and nowhere on the earth left to go. It was her husband's brother, Silas Rourke, who put her there, standing on the porch he had no true claim to, and telling her that a woman without a deed in her name was a woman without a home. Whatever grief she carried for the man who died in that very house not 4 months before. She had her mother's shawl, a tin of matches, a Bible with her husband's handwriting in the margins, and that thin fold of money. And with it she bought, for $6 even, a heap of collapsed timber and blown grit that the land office called Halloran's Rest, an abandoned relay station out past the edge of the Dakota Badlands, a place so cursed by rumor that the clerk laughed when she paid for it, certain she'd thrown her last coins into a hole in the world. Folks called it foolish. Folks called it worse. But sealed behind its ruined walls waited something that would not just alter the shape of Verity Rourke's life, but would settle a debt owed to an entire township for 6 and 20 years. Something that would prove, in the end, that the wildest legend the frontier ever told about that stretch of broken land was not wild enough to hold the truth. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Rourke. If you're watching this from a place that others have written off as empty or worthless, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear where you're joining us from tonight. Verity had been born Verity Ashgrove in 1846, in a river town in Ohio where her father mended harness leather and her mother took in mending of a different kind. Torn friendships, broken accounts, disputes between neighbors that needed a patient, even-tempered woman to sit at a table and listen until the truth of a matter rose up on its own, the way cream rises in a pail left standing. It was from her mother that Verity learned the skill that would matter most in the years to come, though she did not know it then. The art of reading what people left unsaid, of noticing the gap between a story and the way a person's hands moved while they told it. Her father taught her leatherwork and knotcraft, and how to read a wagon's were to know how far it had traveled and how heavy its load had been, skills that seemed, to a girl in a river town, like nothing more than a way to be useful around the shop. She married Daniel Rourke in 1868, a freight man with a gentle laugh and a business inherited from his own father, hauling goods along the wagon roads between the railhead towns and the smaller settlements that the rails had not yet reached. Daniel's younger brother Silas worked the business too, though with less patience for the long hours and more appetite for the ledger's bottom line than for the customers who depended on them. Verity kept the books for the Rourke Freight Company for 19 years, and it was there her mother's gift ripened into something sharper. She could look at a column of figures and feel, the way another woman might feel a draft under a door, exactly where a number had been coaxed into lying. She never had cause to use that feeling against her own family, not in all those years, because she trusted Daniel, and she believed, in her plain and steady way, that trust and honesty were simply how decent people conducted their affairs. She raised no children of her own. 2 infants she lost in her 20s. Grief she carried quietly and without complaint, and she poured what mothering she had left into the freight company's drivers, mending their coats, doctoring their small hurts, remembering the names of their wives and sweethearts. The town of Andersford, where the Rourke Company was headquartered, came to regard Verity as something like a fixture of decency, a woman you could bring trouble to. She believed, without ever having tested it, that this regard would hold steady no matter what storms came. She believed that goodness, once established, simply continued, the way a river continues once it has cut its bed. It was a belief the next 4 months would take from her entirely, though it would, in time, be given back to her transformed into something far sturdier than the innocent version she'd started with. Daniel Rourke died of a fever in the spring of 1887, quickly and without warning, the kind of death that leaves no time for a man to set his affairs in careful order, and it was in the weeks after his burial that Verity discovered how little the world's regard was worth when it was not written down in a lawyer's hand. Silas had always kept the company's legal papers close to his vest, a habit Verity had once taken for simple carefulness, and in the settling of Daniel's estate it emerged that the freight company's deed, the land it stood on, and every wagon and mule in its yard were titled solely to Silas and Daniel jointly, with no provision whatsoever for a widow who had kept the books but never once put her name to the paper. Verity had trusted her husband's word instead of a courthouse record, and now her husband was gone and only the record remained. Silas did not waste time on cruelty dressed up as sorrow. He came to her directly, not 2 weeks after the funeral, and told her that the company could not carry the weight of supporting a widow who brought it no legal claim, that he had a family of his own to think of, that she ought to understand a business was a business. She reminded him of 19 years of ledgers kept true, of nights spent stitching harness by lamplight for drivers who could not afford a saddler, of the winter she had nursed his own wife through a lung fever without asking so much as a thank you in return. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he has decided not to pay, and told her she had 1 month. She left before the month was out, unable to bear the sight of her own kitchen being rearranged by another woman's hands. And by the time she walked the Wagon road out of Andersford for the last time, she had learned the hardest lesson of her adult life, that kindness given freely is not the same as security earned, and that a woman's worth, in the eyes of the law and of men who wish to be rid of her, could be erased as easily as chalk from a slate. She did not weep on that road, though she wanted to. She simply walked, her mother's shawl around her shoulders, her father's knotcraft in her capable hands, and $9.40 standing between her and the entire remainder of her life. She might have gone to a cousin in Iowa or thrown herself on the mercy of the church women in the next county, and no one would have blamed her for it. Instead, she found herself drawn toward the one direction nobody in her right mind traveled, which was west and further west, out past the last true farms and into the broken country, where the land buckled up into gray and rust-colored hills that the local Lakota called the place bad in every sense, and that white settlers had simply taken to calling the Badlands, as if one word could hold the whole strange grief of it. She had heard, as everyone in that country had heard, the old story of the Halloran Wagon train, a party of some 40 souls who in the autumn of 1861 had set out along the northern freight road toward the gold fields and vanished so completely that not one board of a wagon nor one bone of a mule was ever found. Those searchers combed the Badlands for 2 full seasons. The story had grown, as such stories do, into something closer to scripture than history. Some said the train had been swallowed by the earth itself. Some said a curse lay on the ground. Some said travelers still heard wagon wheels creaking on windless nights along that old road. What was certain was that the relay station built to serve that road, a low stone and timber outpost called Halloran's Rest, had stood empty and unclaimed for 26 years, its ownership tangled in an old company's bankruptcy, its name enough to make even hardened land speculators cross the road rather than walk past its gate. When Verity arrived at the land office in the rail town of Cutbank Junction and asked, plainly, what a woman might buy in that country for $9, the clerk, an amused young man named Otis Pell, told her the only thing on the books cheap enough was the cursed old relay station out of Halloran's Rest. And he told her, so the way a man tells a joke he doesn't expect anyone to take seriously. She paid him $6 for it on the spot, kept $3.40 in her hem, and told him she would need directions. The walk out to Halloran's Rest took the better part of 2 days, and Verity slept the night between them wrapped in her shawl beneath a shelf of red rock, listening to a silence so complete it seemed to have a weight of its own. When she came upon the station at last, in the flat gray light of a Badlands morning, she understood at once why the town had left it to rot. Its roof had fallen in on the eastern half, its corral fence lay scattered like matchsticks, and the well beside it was choked with 2 decades of blown dust. But the western half of the building stood square and sound, its stone walls thick as a fortress, and Verity, who had spent 19 years reading wagons and ledgers for the truth beneath their surface, noticed something the Badlands wind had not yet erased. The door to that western room, though weathered gray as the rest, hung on hinges that had been oiled far more recently than 26 years past. She let herself in with the strength of her shoulder against a stuck latch and found a single room, swept strangely clean of the drifted sand that choked every other corner of the ruin, containing a narrow cot, a cold stove, a shelf of tinned goods gone to rust, and, built into the back wall behind a length of canvas, a door of iron-banded oak that had no business existing in a relay station meant only for changing tired mules. It was locked, and it was locked well, with a mechanism far finer than anything Verity had seen on a frontier building in all her years of freight work, the kind of lock a banker might trust with a strongbox. She sat on the narrow cot in the gray morning light, in the dust and silence of a place the whole country called cursed, and felt for the first time since her husband's death something other than grief. She felt the old, familiar prickle of a ledger that did not add up, a story that did not match its own telling. And she resolved, with the stubbornness that had carried her through 19 years of quiet service and 4 months of quiet ruin, that she would not leave that room until she understood what it was guarding. It took Verity the better part of a week, working by lamplight and by the strength of her father's old tools, which she had carried west in her single bag out of some instinct she could not have named, to work the iron-banded door loose from its frame rather than its lock, prying at the hinge pins with a patience that would have exhausted a younger and less determined woman. What she found behind it was not gold, though gold there was 7 dull bars of it stacked in a corner like ordinary firewood, and it was not the bones of 40 travelers, though for one held breath she feared it might be. It was a room built by careful, deliberate hands to outlast whoever had built it. Shelves of tin provisions still sound in their sealing wax, bolts of oiled canvas, crates of tools, and, most precious of all to a woman who had spent her life reading the truth inside a column of numbers, a stack of leather-bound ledgers and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon gone the color of dust. The ledgers belonged to a woman named Agatha Voss, station keeper of Halloran's Rest from 1858 until some date the final entry did not give, and as Verity read by lamplight long into that first night, the true history of the vanished wagon train rose up off those pages like a body-long thought drowned finally coming to shore. The Halloran party had not vanished into the earth at all. They had been caught in October of 1861 by an early blizzard so violent it had driven them off the marked road and into a hidden fold of the Badlands that no map showed and no searcher, 2 years later, had thought to look, a fold containing a spring-fed valley, green even in that broken country, which Agatha Voss had known of from years spent trading with the people native to that land, and to which she had guided the freezing, starving survivors under cover of the storm, saving 31 souls of the original 40. What Agatha Voss had not done, in the years that followed, was tell the world she had done it, because the survivors, orphaned of the company that funded their journey and terrified of a young, ambitious railroad concern that was at that very time buying up Badlands water rights for a pittance from anyone who believed the land worthless, had made a pact to stay hidden in their green valley and let the world believe them dead, rather than surrender the one thing that had saved their lives to men, who would only strip it for profit and cast them out again. Agatha Voss had kept their secret, kept their gold, pooled from what little the survivors carried, kept as a common store against future need, and kept this station standing as a quiet gate between the hidden valley and a world that must never know it existed, until whatever illness or accident had ended her own life stopped her pen mid-ledger and left the truth locked behind an oak door for 26 years. The letters told Verity more than the ledgers did, in the aching, careful hand of people who had expected, someday, that someone honest might find what they'd left behind. There was a letter from a woman named Constance Reyes, one of the original Halloran survivors, describing the valley itself, a place they had come to call Amity Hollow, hidden behind a wall of red rock accessible only through a narrow, disguised draw that Agatha Voss had marked on a hand-drawn map folded inside the ledger's back cover, showing 31 souls grown, over 26 years, into a small and self-sufficient settlement of perhaps 90, farming a spring-fed valley that the outside world had every reason to believe held nothing but curse and bone. There was a second letter, unfinished, in a different and more recent hand, describing troubles. A survey crew from the Cut Bank Northern Railroad had been sighted twice in the past 2 years scouting the outer Badlands, and the valley's people feared that whatever accident had once hidden them from the world was wearing thin, that the truth would soon be found by men with far less patience for it than a lone freight keeper's widow. Verity sat with those letters until the lamp burned low, and she understood, with the same plain clarity that had once told her a column of figures did not add up, that she was holding in her hands not merely her own rescue from ruin, but the fate of 90 people who had spent 26 years trusting a stranger's silence to keep them alive, and the fate, too, though she did not yet know its shape, of a whole drought-starved township that lay not 4 days' ride from a spring the size of a small lake that nobody living believed existed. She found the hidden draw 3 days later, following Agatha Voss's careful map through a Badlands maze of red rock and dry coulee that would have swallowed a less patient traveler. And when she came at last through the narrow stone gate into Amity Hollow, she stood a long while simply looking, unable to speak, at fields of corn and barley green against the surrounding waste, at a spring-fed pond ringed with willow, at low sod houses, and a scattering of children who stopped their play to stare, at the stranger in the gate, as if she were something conjured from a story. The people of Amity Hollow received her first with the guarded silence of a community that had survived 26 years by trusting no outsider, and it was only when Verity produced Agatha Voss's ledgers and spoke the names Constance Reyes and the Halloran party with the plain, careful respect of a woman who had spent 19 years learning to listen before she spoke, that the eldest among them, a white-haired woman named Constance Reyes herself, now near 80 and still sharp-eyed as a hawk, stepped forward and took Verity's hands in both of hers and wept without shame. Constance told her, over the following days, the fuller history the letters had only sketched, how the valley's people had built a quiet, careful life, trading in secret through Agatha Voss, and after her death, through a chain of trusted intermediaries that had grown thin and fragile with the years, how they feared every season now that the outside world's hunger for Badlands water rights would find them before they found a way to be found safely. Verity told them, in turn, her own story. The freight company, Silas, the $6, the door she had pried from its frame rather than abandon a mystery. And it was Constance Reyes who said, in the plain voice of a woman who had learned long ago that hope must be practical to be worth anything, that perhaps Verity Rourke had not stumbled on a Halloran's Rest by foolishness after all, but had been sent by whatever providence watches over patient women to finish the work Agatha Voss had begun and never lived to complete, to bring Amity Hollow and its water and its 90 souls safely and rightfully into the light. The trouble, as trouble in that country so often did, arrived wearing the shape of men with maps and money. Verity had not been back at Halloran's Rest more than a fortnight, working with Constance Reyes and a young valley man named Peter Ironcloud on a plan to file the land claim properly and lawfully in Amity Hollow's own name before any survey crew could stumble onto it first, when a rider came up the old Wagon road bearing news that struck her harder than any threat from a stranger could have. The Cut Bank Northern Railroad's chief land agent, contracted to survey and buy up water rights across that entire stretch of Badlands, was none other than Silas Rourke, who had sold a share of the freight business the very month he'd cast Verity out and taken instead a position that paid him a commission on every acre of water he could wrest from settlers too poor or too ignorant to know its worth. Silas arrived at Halloran's Rest himself within the week, dressed now in a railroad agent's good coat, and he did not recognize at first that the woman standing in the station doorway was the same widow he had turned out into the mud 4 months before. So changed was she by sun and purpose. When recognition did come to him, it came with the particular ugly delight of a man who believes he has found a second chance to profit from someone he has already wronged once. He told her, with the easy confidence of a man reading from a contract, that the Badlands water rights in this district belonged, by an old and largely forgotten territorial statute, to whoever first filed a legal claim upon them, that he intended to file that claim within the month on behalf of the railroad, and that any squatters found living on unclaimed land when the survey went through would be removed without compensation. Curse or no curse, legend or no legend, he offered Verity, with something close to contempt dressed as generosity, a token payment for the relay station and its $6 worth of worthless ruin, so the railroad's claim might proceed without the inconvenience of a dispute. Verity, who had spent 19 years learning to hold her tongue over a ledger until she was certain of her ground, told him only that she would consider his offer, and watched him ride away, well pleased with himself, believing he had once again gotten the better of a woman he had never once bothered to truly see. What Silas Rourke did not know, and what Verity spent the following weeks moving quickly and quietly to secure, was that Agatha Voss's 26-year-old ledgers contained something far stronger than any territorial statute favoring whoever filed first. A water rights claim already filed. In 1859, 2 full years before the Halloran party's supposed vanishing by Agatha Voss herself, in the proper legal form of the era, recorded at the Territorial Land Office in Bismarck under the name of the Halloran Rest Company, a filing so old and so thoroughly forgotten by everyone, but its dead filer that not even the railroad's most thorough survey had thought to search records that far back. Verity rode 4 days to Bismarck with Peter Ironcloud at her side and Constance Riz's blessing behind her, carrying Agatha Voss's original ledgers as proof, and found a filing exactly where the dead woman's careful hand had recorded it, dust-covered and unchallenged in the Territorial Archive, its priority over any claims Silas Rourke might file older by nearly 30 years than his own. The Territorial Land Registrar, a patient and correct man named Aldous Fry, who had clearly seen his share of railroad agents trying to bully settlers off contested ground, examined the filing, examined Verity's careful reconstruction of the Halloran survivor's history, and confirmed to her, in the dry, unhurried language of legal men, that the Halloran Rest Company's water rights claims stood valid, unbroken, and entirely superior to any filing the Cut Bank Northern Railroad might attempt. Verity Rourke, widow of Daniel Rourke, holder by purchase of Halloran's Rest itself, was in that moment, and by the plainest operation of law, the sole surviving legal heir to a water claim covering the very spring that fed Amity Hollow and, as it happened, a wide swath of the drought-parched grazing country around Cut Bank Junction besides. Land that dozens of struggling homestead families in that town have been fighting the railroad's water agents over for 2 dry seasons already, unable to prove any prior claim of their own. When Silas Rourke returned to Halloran's Rest a month later, filing papers in hand and a surveyor's crew at his back, expecting only to formalize what he believed was already his for the taking, he found instead Verity Rourke standing in the station doorway, with Aldous Fry's certified confirmation in her hand, and Constance Reyes and a dozen other Amity Hollow residents standing quietly behind her, no longer hidden, no longer afraid, their long secret finally spent in service of something larger than their own safekeeping. Verity did not gloat, though she would have been forgiven for it. She simply told Silas, in the same plain and even voice she had once used to balance his own company's books for 19 years, that the water rights his railroad wished to seize belonged, by a filing older than his own birth, to the Halloran Rest Company, of which she was now the sole legal proprietor, and that she had no intention of selling to a company, or a man, who built its fortunes on taking from those too poor or too trusting to defend themselves. She told him, further, that she intended to open the claim not to the railroad's profit, but to every family in Cut Bank Junction and every soul in Amity Hollow alike, sharing the spring's water under terms fair and recorded and witnessed, so that no one, not settler, not survivor, not even a man who had once turned his own brother's widow out into the mud, could ever again use hunger or thirst as a tool to strip a person of what little they had. Silas left that day with his surveyor's crew and his railroad papers and nothing else, and word traveled, as word does in small country, of how the widow he had cast off had returned to bring water to a town he'd meant to profit from squeezing dry. Within the season, the railroad quietly reassigned him to a distant district, and the particular cold justice of it was not that he was punished by any hand of Verity's, but simply that the world at last saw him plainly for what he was, and stopped, extending him the credit of good regard he had never once earned honestly. The town of Cut Bank Junction, once so quick to laugh at a widow paying $6 for a cursed ruin, gathered that autumn to watch Verity Rourke, Constance Reyes, and the long-hidden families of Amity Hollow sign a water-sharing charter at the very land office where Otis Pell had once sold her the relay station as a joke, and it was Otis himself, red-faced and humbled, who drew up the papers this time with a care he had not thought the transaction deserved before. The gold Agatha Voss had kept against future need was spent, at Verity's insistence and Constance's blessing, not on any single family's comfort, but on a proper well and irrigation channel to serve both the valley and the parched grazing land beyond it. A public work that bore, at Constance Reyes's own suggestion, a small stone marker naming Agatha Voss as the woman whose quiet courage had first made it possible. Verity Rourke, once a widow with $9.40 to her name, became in that season something the whole district spoke of with a kind of reverent astonishment. Not for the gold she might have kept and did not, but for the plain fact that she had walked into the one place everyone else called worthless and found there, waiting patiently for 26 years, everything an entire community needed to be made whole. And so we return, as we promised, to that gray Badlands morning when a 41-year-old widow with nothing but a shawl and a father's knotcraft stood before a ruin that the whole country had agreed to call cursed. What waited behind that oak door was never a curse at all, and never quite a legend either, though it wore a legend's shape for 26 years. It was only ever the plain, stubborn truth that Agatha Voss had died protecting. That people cast off and written out of the record are not therefore worthless, that a thing abandoned by careless eyes may hold, in careful hands, the means to save far more than one life. Verity Rourke did not set out to defy every frontier legend the Badlands ever told. She set out only to find the truth beneath a locked door, the way she had once found the truth beneath a column of figures, patient and unhurried, trusting that what did not add up would eventually explain itself to a woman willing to listen. In the end, it was that patience, learned at her mother's table and tested by every loss the years brought her, that restored not only her own fortune, but the fortune of 90 hidden souls and a whole thirsty township besides. Proof enough, we think, that the quietest virtues are so often the ones the frontier most needed, and so rarely the ones it thought to look for. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Verity Rourke tonight. If her story stirred something in you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that what looks worthless to the world is not always worthless at all. We'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we treasure the stories you share with us in return. Until next time, stay close.